BBC Radio 2. So many questions have been made about this new dance craze called acid. What people really want to know is how the story all goes about acid. This is acid.
In 1988, there was a culture shift. Acid house turned dour 80s Britain into a technicolor dance floor and liberated a whole generation who still don't seem to have stopped dancing, despite the fact that they're now in their 40s and listening to Radio 2. Since those early heady days, house music has become everything from soundtrack to evil youth activity to soundtrack for the establishment. Now it's simply the soundtrack to most people's gym workouts. I'm Chris Coco, and I'm part of the generation who never grew up. 20 years on and those repetitive beats still shape what I do and who I am. But how do I explain what happened and why it still matters to my 14-year-old son? Long ago, in the lands before computers, when mobile phones looked like bricks, what was it about that first acid house experience that changed everything?
All I always remember about is the variety of people there. Seeing that many people go mad to intros of records, you never can forget, really.
It was kind of like middle ground, really, with that fusion of people. It's like a different energy.
Nothing could really describe the energy, which was incredibly benign. Really did feel like what I'd been looking for all my adult life.
People that bought our music, they looked like me. And that was weird. I was part of a scene that looked like me, and I looked like them, and I liked that.
You really felt very close very quickly to people that you went out clubbing with. Suddenly you had this tight-knit community, and after the club you'd go back to someone's house and you might not get home until Monday morning or Monday afternoon, you know, who knows.
Don't you want some more? Can you feel it?
I have the luxury in my life of being able to put those tracks on and think to lying on a bench in Ibiza Harbour after amnesia at 8 o'clock in the morning and watch a submarine rise and you're going, oh wow, you know, and all the sailors get out and march past us while we were asleep on a bench.
That night everything changed then. It was just like rub everything out and start again now, do something new.
The first time I realised it was going to be big was in a little warehouse club that Mr. C, who was later in the Shaman, had organised. You knew that everybody there was going to go away and do something of their own.
Everyone was cuddling each other and they was in unity with each other. They felt a part of a new generation of what happens now, and a new scene, a niche or something which we were creating, nobody else.
The Chemical Brothers, a guy called Gerald, John Marsh of The Beloved, Carl Hyde from Underworld, Bill Brewster, Peter Hook of New Order, Rocky from Express 2, Cheryl Garrett and Carl Cox are just some of the people helping me search for that day-glow idealism we had back in '88. For me, the rhythms first took hold down by the sea. So here we are, we've come down to Brighton to revisit the scene of my first acid house experience, which was at a small club under the road on the seafront. I first started doing a club here in 1988, so it was 20 years ago, after some of my compatriots had been to London to Shoom and Spectrum. We thought we should try and do something like that in Brighton and invite people like Paul Oakenfold and Danny Rampling to come and DJ for us. First week, the place was pretty empty. Then almost overnight, that club became the coolest place in town because we started this nightclub called Frenzy, and after a few weeks, the queue would stretch right up this slope. People waiting to get in the door, which was just down here. So let's walk down. It's actually, you can't get in here now because it's now a fire exit, because the club's expanded quite a lot. So we go down and go in the main door and see if the small arch where we started out is still in existence. So what you'd do is you'd open this door. When Frenzy was on, you couldn't see any further than your hand in front of your face because the whole place was so full of smoke from the smoke machine. To our left there was a massive strobe which was flashing, so when you walked through that door all you could see was this kind of ethereal vision of hands and faces coming out of the smoke, like some kind of weird Renaissance painting of heaven or hell, not quite sure which. And this very loud music, it's like repetitive, thumping music. Joe Smooth's Promised Land sums up the feeling we had at the Zap, at Shoom and Spectrum in London, at the Hacienda in Manchester. But did all that promise ever come to anything? There's no doubt that people had a good time, but was it anything more than smoke machines, baggy clothes, smiley faces, and very loud music?
Oh, Acid House was just, it changed everything. You know, it's a bit like putting a pink sock in a white wash. It just sort of turned everything a different colour immediately, this tiny thing. So it started off with a very small group of people in London, but it spread like wildfire, because once you'd gone, you wanted to go again. You also wanted to bring all your mates because it was such good fun, and then you wanted to start a party of your own.
The naivety, I suppose, of myself and quite a lot of people was that there was a real core belief, if people were turned on to this, that it would enact a kind of societal transformation as well. You know, I think in a Time Out interview or something like that, I actually suggested putting ecstasy in the water supply, which is beyond stupid, really.
It didn't change the world in a way that a lot of the early people felt that it could or it would, but I really do think it loosened the attitudes of people in the UK, and young men and women learned to talk to each other in a way that was non-sexual for probably the first time, which sounds slightly preposterous now when you look back at it and you think, well, it's just a load of house records made by black gay men in Chicago, but at the time it really felt like that.
The coming out of gay culture in Manchester, I think, was definitely triggered by Acid House.
Everything got wiped away. The way you dressed, the music that you listened to, the way you danced, the way you spoke, your attitude, what you drank and how you sort of lived just completely changed overnight.
So I'm not alone in thinking that this music and the culture that surrounded it changed everything. But was our thing really as revolutionary as the hippie movement of '68 or the punks in '77? To explain to your teenager just why this music without lyrics, this movement without a manifesto, had such an impact, you have to paint a picture of life before 1988. Professor Steve Redhead.
Youth unemployment was huge. There was a dourness and doom to the economy and everything that was happening, and a lot of people went to places like Ibiza or to Europe. These people weren't interested in organised work because they couldn't get organised work at home, and they were the people who actually brought back the culture.
At the start of the 80s, certainly, travelling around the country in groups of friends is something mainly boys did to football matches, and they went to fight each other. You know, the idea of getting in a car and going to Leeds to go to a club, if you're from London, isn't something you really did. And if you did, you were very careful not to speak when you got there in case you got duffed up.
Uptight, really. Before that, there was a lot of conflict in all kinds of different ways.
Thatcher's Britain, there was a lot of unemployment and people feeling down, and it was just the perfect time for it to come along.
I've actually been invited to conferences in places like Berlin. They see kind of derelict factories and warehouses mirroring what was happening in Manchester in the mid-1980s. and they understand that youth culture played a part in changing Manchester from that derelict city to the thriving post-industrial city that it is now.
Recession, racial tension, it's the background of two-tone, punk, the Beat Generation and acid house. Dole cues tend to foster musical revolution, and one northern city that had seen its fair share of troubles was about to go through a roller coaster ride of pills, thrills and bellyaches. Manchester, or Madchester as it was about to become, would never be the same again after New Order woke up to the sound of acid house on a bench in Ibiza and loved it so much they decided to buy the club.
How does it feel to treat me like you do? When you laid your hands upon me and told me who you are, thought I was mistaken. I thought I'd heard your words. Tell me, how do I feel? Tell me now, how do I feel? Those who came before me lived through their vocations, from the past until completion. They'll turn away no more. And I still find it so hard to say what I need to say, but I'm quite sure that you'll tell me just how I should feel today.
The Hacienda was a blueprint for the 1990s Super Club. It was actually in a back street in a sort of slightly dodgy part of Manchester. We're standing outside it now. We look up, the facade's gone, the old building's completely disappeared, and in its place, a block of luxury flats. They used to have a sign out here, it said, "Now the party's over, it's time to come home." That's when they were selling the flats. We're going to find out in a minute how much they're worth now. But when I came here, when it was the club, the whole of this street was a mass of humanity. It was a huge queue that led from the door right down as far as you can see. It's a very long straight street. People dancing before they even got inside because they were so excited, wearing their dungarees and their extremely large baggy t-shirts, their kind of Manchester mop top haircuts. And this is where the door was, and it's still the door to the block of apartments. Now it says, "Welcome to the Hacienda Apartments. To contact the concierge, press 500 call." I don't think we'll be doing that. You used to have to ask a friendly doorman if you could come in or not. So in some ways it hasn't changed at all. We've just been having a look at the Hacienda, which used to be quite a famous nightclub, and it's now luxury flats. And do you know how much they're worth, the flats?
They start around 200-ish for a two-bedroom without parking, and go up to anything up to nearly $500,000 from the larger ones.
$500,000? Nothing compared to the amount the Hacienda was losing New Order back in '88. The late, great Tony Wilson was their guide and financial guru.
For the first 2 years, because we thought we were providing a social service, we had it open every night of the week, and hence lost millions more pounds than the original £1 million it cost to build it, yes. You get this weird culture begins in the middle of 1986, which is when Mr. Pickering, Mr. Da Silva and Mr. Park begin on a Friday night playing this very obscure, almost in that point unknown, imports from Detroit and Chicago that at that point were called house music or acid.
Peter Hook.
The interesting thing about New Order and Acid House was that we were in Ibiza in 1987 doing Technique when basically it all began, and it was amazing being in that place at that time. 1 minute it was normal and the next minute it was completely off its head.
There'd be 1,500 people there. You could feel the sweat rising, literally. The weird thing was that back then we didn't really know what that kind of clubbing was about. There wasn't any role models for it, but that's what made it so exciting, I think. You know, when people started putting strobe machines on and dry ice, and people started wearing kind of day glow style t-shirts and baggy clothes and all that kind of stuff, it all happened in a very unself-conscious way. in a way, it was the blueprint for how people imagine great clubs are now. When you go to great clubs now, you want that experience of that very sort of intense excitement. You want that smoke, you want those strobes, you want the podiums, you want that madness. You want to feel in a way that you've never felt in your life before.
And it wasn't just the old guard that were inspired. Manchester was also home to one of the biggest bands from dance music's second generation. With a uniquely British take on house and a peculiar taste in footwear, the Chemical Brothers took dance music to the world.
We went to Manchester in 1989, and before that, I'd been to the Hacienda in 1988, actually. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to go to Manchester. At the time, even though it was a massive sort of youth phenomenon, it was still... When you walk down the street, you see another raver because they're wearing kickers or something, and you go, oh yeah, nice one, raver. And so when I saw Ed in his purple wallabies, I was like, yeah, fellow raver.
One track made by just one guy in his garret bedroom in the middle of this city-wide experiment was so powerful that everyone who hears it returns to its hypnotic simplicity again and again. That guy was called Gerald.
When people say like bedroom producer, it takes me back to my attic. I remember like messing around with the filters, thinking it was bloody cold in here. There was ice on the inside of the windows. I was actually thinking of chiseling ice with a chisel, and I actually called it, I used to name all the bass lines, and that was like a chisel bass. Around about the same time, I discovered the sampler. Because by now I'd been used to manipulating the synths, I thought, well, I wanted everything on this tune to be manipulated. So I put the vocal in and then reversed it. And like when you played it back with the forward vocal, it just created this weird kind of entrainment. It's just like this hypnotic kind of sound.
The thing I thought about Acid House was that it was very much a do-it-yourself mentality, and that's what I enjoyed. I enjoyed that it was like a keyboard punk, that people were doing it in the bedrooms. I remember one absolutely hilarious moment. I was judging a talent competition at Moles in Bath, and I was judging it with the guy out of Tears for Fears. He had just finished their second album, I think, which turned out to be the most expensive album ever made, and the DJ put on Voodoo Ray. And Miss Rowland said to the DJ, who was that? It's that record, it's absolutely wonderful. And the DJ said, oh yeah, it's made by a guy in his bedroom in Manchester, you know, for about 50 quid. And the look on his face.
It was all about doing it yourself. Bedroom producers were knocking out club hit after club hit, and everyone had a favourite. Cheryl Garrett was at Paul Oakenfold's Spectrum at Heaven.
I think something like the Todd Terry track, Can You Party, because, you know, one of the great moments of Acid House that I remember is people trying to dance in the street after clubs had finished. And one particular night where the police came with their sirens on and everyone started jumping on top of cars and dancing because it sounded like that record. And that's something I'll always remember seeing.
Give It To Me by Bam Bam maybe, which is an idiotic record really in many ways, but I think it was probably the first one that I actually left a club remembering what the record might be called and going to a shop the next day, have you got the one that goes, give it to me, you know, that kind of thing. Being in record shops at that time was brilliant just because you had people constantly coming in going, oh, I heard this track last night, you know, that was all that was taking place, and the job of the person behind the counter was more detective than retail.
John Marsh of The Beloved went on to make one of the first complete albums of the movement, But what was the appeal of this music without lyrics? Dave Haslam was one of the first DJs to play house music in the UK.
I even like the fact there weren't any lyrics in a lot of it. It was avant-garde, and it was experimental, and it was weird, and it was actually music that weirdos listened to. And it sounded even better, it soon turned out, to people on ecstasy. And I think that kind of synthesis became what defined that whole era.
I just love the snotty synth, and whenever I hear it, it excites me. And whether that is just some kind of Freudian memory of Pavlov's dog, because I remember how wild it was in 1988, I don't know what it is, but I always get a huge kick. It sends a shiver down my spine. It was a very, very different way of recording. It was a very, very mismatched, and it was on the edge. And everything now, because of the technology that we have, is very controlled, and everybody has the same type of technology. Whereas all those were like one-offs, and never to be caught again, I don't think.
Voodoo Ray, Acid Tracks, Your Love and the Times themselves were perhaps happy accidents, but none of it would have been possible without the relatively cheap technology that was becoming available to more and more producers. Roland's 808 and 909 drum machines and the now legendary 303 bassline, the original acid squelch machine. The music may have begun in the US, but it was UK attitude that gave it energy. The analogue punk was out there living the lifestyle and then carrying on the party in his bedroom. DJ Bill Brewster was already immersed in the world of nightclubs, and Carl Hyde of Underworld had already had a brief career as a pop star. But it was the revolutionary spirit of acid house that had them hooked.
The difference was that punk talked a lot about rebellion and independence and all of those sort of things, but it never actually really delivered it. All the bands that were important in punk signed to big labels, basically, whereas with acid house, that really did happen. There were people making music in their bedrooms and pressing it up on a white label and selling it out the back of a van to Black Market and loads of other record stores in Soho. So that kind of DIY ethos really came alive during acid house.
And the dance floor gave us an opportunity to get our music across without the needs of the paraphernalia of the music industry, without radio, without press or any infrastructure. We placed something on the dance floor. If people liked it, they might buy it.
This punk attitude of doing it yourself and refusing to accept the status quo wasn't about to stay in the bedroom though. Once the revolutionary spirit was unleashed on the good old British countryside, there was bound to be a reaction. The BBC responded by banning any record with the word acid in the title. The police set up the Pay Party Unit.
Police in the home counties made more than 50 arrests over the weekend in a crackdown on acid house parties. Hundreds of officers from different forces staged separate raids in London, Sussex, Kent and Essex. A number of people have been charged with drugs offences. One policeman was injured in a raid in Sevenoaks in Kent, and some of the partygoers there have made allegations about police brutality. The timing of the raids made it look as if the four different forces involved had got together to plan the crackdown. But Chief Inspector Roy Clark of Essex Police says that didn't happen.
I think it's just that all the home counties police forces are becoming concerned that this craze, as it were, doesn't move into their respective counties. That's certainly the case as far as Essex is concerned.
The idea that we should be prisoners in our own home for a weekend so that 6,500 unspecified individuals can have fun, I find unacceptable, and I don't think it's striking the necessary balance.
Many of them seem to end up in hospital, to go on dancing all night for 12 hours in a noise which can't be very good for their ears, can't do much for their health. And if they have got to have these events, then they should be in purpose-built buildings where they don't upset other people.
Ronnie Size witnessed the change, and Does It Offend You, Yeah? Saw the reports.
What happened was it became a little bit too free, and the police and the neighbouring residents of these fields or these buildings started to make some noise about not really enjoying the company of all these ravers partying for weeks on end. I think it's Castle Morton and Lechlade had between 60,000 people passing through over the space of a week.
I think I remember watching it on the news. There was all like this big connection between the big smiley yellow face, the drug acid, and new age travellers in warehouses causing all sorts of havoc and ruining the foundations of the country.
Steve Redhead and Carl Cox saw the changes coming.
The tabloid press would talk about acid as LSD, for example. Acid, for most people, most DJs certainly at that time, meant acid burning, the Chicago term, the sampling and the kind of squelchy noise of the technology. But the tabloid press said, oh, this is LSD, psychedelic drugs, and there were huge overreactions in the papers. Politically, the late 1980s, still under Thatcher, was a real repressive regime. And I think the law itself, which eventually did change, was built on the back of that moral panic.
It then kind of lent itself to be controlled. So the government really, they wanted all the organisers to have a licence or a permit to at least play music and at least to be able to have toilets, have the Red Cross on hand and everything else that goes with it. And I actually agreed with that. I wanted people to be safe when they come to these events. So the mystery has gone now out of what it was like in the early days, but at least the scene still survives based on how much it's moved on and moved forward.
The Criminal Justice Bill in 1993 bans those repetitive beats and moved things back into cash-hungry clubs controlled by the over-30s, but not before the tragic ecstasy-related death of Leah Betts.
Police in Essex have offered an amnesty to youngsters who bought ecstasy tablets from a contaminated batch which has left a teenager in a coma. Leah Betts collapsed during her 18th birthday party at her home in Malden near Basildon. Her parents took it in turns to give her the kiss of life.
I could speak all day, as could Jan, my wife, about don't do this, don't do that in relation to drugs. And I think that one photograph sums everything that we could say up.
The Prime Minister has warned parents that they must join the war against drugs. Speaking at the launch of an information leaflet, Mr Major said people could no longer assume their children were safe.
Drug taking, whatever drug it may be, tends to lead on to hard drugs, and we've seen often enough the tragedy that occurs.
Regretting nothing but the pain. My heart, my life, my world is filled with rain. I'm drowning. When the curtain comes down and the circus is through, no one is left but me, you and all my
The second summer of love was over, and even the Hacienda had been shut down after guns and gangsters took control. None of this had been on the agenda for those preaching the words of peace and love and house music back in '88. But those things did happen, and now the original Freaky Dancers have to explain what it was about to their own kids. Maybe Peter Hook, Bill Brewster, John Marsh and Dave Haslam have an answer to my dilemma.
But as a parent, it's very easy for, to knock round with Sean and Bez and glorify those days and say how wonderful it all was, and yet, it's not actually strictly true, because I've seen a lot of people suffer a lot. I've suffered myself through that hedonistic attitude.
I hope that I'll be honest with them about what I do and did, because I don't think you can start preaching to teenagers when you've been a bit of a lad yourself. I think you kind of have to use your experience in order to hopefully advise them and guide them in a way that's going to help them, but at the same time not constrict them in what they're doing. Inevitably, they're going to want to do their own things and experiment with things that's completely separate from you, and I think you have to learn to accept that.
There's that kind of famous political thing about economy with the truth, but I'm not ashamed of anything that I've done, so I don't really have any problem talking to them or to anybody about it. But I would wait until I thought they were old enough to actually comprehend what it was that I was saying. And I will do my best, that's all you can do.
The real anxiety for me is when the Parent Teachers Association called me up and asked if I'll DJ at the school party, end of term disco. And that kind of creates quite a moral dilemma for me. I want to get involved, but I don't really want to get put into that position. So I normally say no to the PTA.
So maybe not playing the PTA just yet. But after the Criminal Justice Bill became an act, things had to change, and some of the early excitement and sense of idealism certainly left the scene once the party people headed indoors. Cheryl Garrett, Tom from Groove Armada and Ronnie Size felt the fizz fade away.
One of the policemen involved, Ken Tappenden, who ran the special unit against the raves in the south of England, said it was a bit like a boil. You'd lance it and it'd pop up somewhere else in the country. And I think finally they realised that instead of fighting it, accommodating it, legalising it, sanitising it might be the way to go. And it's no coincidence that clubs like the Ministry of Sound started getting their licences just as the police were realising they didn't have the resources to fight the illegal parties.
I do think to a great extent the Criminal Justice Bill and that whole Thatcher era sort of stamping on that scene took the life out of it a little bit, forced it into mainstream clubs, and then you got into that era of the superstar DJ and that spell at the beginning of the end for this kind of era of dance music, really.
A lot of the way the music was being played had changed. The uplifting vibe became a lot more about sticking yourself into a box.
Certainly happy about the turn of events, the breweries.
At that time, in the late 80s, there's no doubt that they started losing money because people weren't buying alcohol at the bar. With things like Alco Pops, they actually started to make an effort to get young drinkers back to the bar again. And in some ways that did work.
This week, the Portman Group, a group which represents the 7 key alcoholic drinks companies, is going to meet to tackle head-on the concern that's been expressed for many months now over what critics say is the targeting of teenagers with alcoholic drinks, especially so-called soft drinks with an alcoholic content. It is, says Eric Appleby, who's the director of Alcohol Concern, an irresponsible marketing strategy.
The pubs may have won the kids back with brightly coloured drinks, but by now the music was everywhere. Underworld sang about drinking lager, 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 and when it was used in the film Trainspotting, it meant that the E-generation even had its own literary voice in Irving Welsh. Dance music was never going away.
When you've got records like Born Slippy that crossed over to a much wider audience, that certainly brought in the massed floating voter, if you like. The people that buy singles gave us money and opportunities to play on a much broader platform like the rock festivals and be welcomed onto radio and TV, and we became a bankable commodity, and that certainly opens up some doors. But as anything, if you're part of a scene, the clock's ticking.
All scenes ebb and flow, but dance music from our kind of acid house equals punk rock moment in the late 80s just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger from that time all the way through the 90s, and that run from the late 80s to 1999, 2000 was unprecedented, and I'll be staggered if it happens again.
One way that acid house did differ from punk is that it was Thatcher's children who produced it. dance music was never shy about making a few quid. All hail the superstar DJ. Peter Hook, Dave Haslam and Pete Tong saw the rise.
When I was in a group and when I was running the Hacienda, I actually thought that DJs were overblown. I thought they were self-important, and I thought they were the biggest arseholes that ever walked the earth, considering all they were doing was playing other people's music. And then 20 years later, to become a DJ, I found out it was true, and I am. So I was delighted there. I was right about that one anyway. It fitted in perfectly. But I mean, yes, the Hacienda, Rob Gretton, Tony Wilson, did begin the superstar DJ culture.
People started bringing in air horns and whistles, and that fitted perfectly because a lot of the music we were playing had breakdowns in it. It had moments where the music would almost stop. That kind of accentuated that idea that it was about the DJ and the music and the audience, and it was about that relationship and that chemistry. And that's one of the reasons why the DJs became superstar DJs, is that I think they had a tendency to forget the role of the audience.
Any DJ that is on the scene, on the circuit, in a very prominent way and has been there for a long, long time, will naturally have to go through a course of reinvention. Either the music that made them famous goes out of fashion, or they simply get bored and just to stay interesting that they want to discover different things. It's not that dissimilar, I suppose, to rock star or pop star. You know, some people constantly want to hear your old hits when you're trying to play them your new album, and that's kind of the same with the DJ.
Superstar DJs, supersized clubs and super popular new labour. By 1997, dance music had even become the soundtrack for the new government.
A new dawn has broken, has it not? And it is wonderful. We always said that if we had the courage to change, then we could do it, and we did it.
They turned from one side to the other to acknowledge the cheers of people on all sides. Britain's new Prime Minister. Tony Blair welcomed what he called a new dawn, and as he spoke almost, it seemed the dawn has arrived. It is a crystal clear morning, no longer nighttime, it's morning here on the south bank of the Thames.
2 or 3 years later, when Blair comes to power in 1997, he uses, slightly out of sync, D Ream's Things Are Going to Get Better as a kind of celebration. So even in those 2 or 3 years where the law is supposed to be cracking down, you get an assumption that there wasn't really that much of a problem, and it became Labour Party theme tune.
De Ream as the backing track for number 10. Of course, the next generation of switched-on and music-savvy kids didn't want to get their kicks on this plump, self-satisfied daddy of a scene. Annie Mac and Express 2 witnessed the switch.
It had that stage after Acid House where it became a big commercial monster. Gatecrasher and all those big northern clubs, those big brands, Renaissance, they were charging 25 quid a night, and you'd go and you'd rave with 5,000 other people, and I came in on the tail end of that, when people were sick of those massive super clubs, and they were sick of having to drive 40 miles to a club and having to queue 20 minutes to put their coat in and having to pay loads of money for a drink and all that.
Lazy took off, and that took us to another level. I mean, we ended up being pop stars because we ended up being number 2 in the national chart. But as that happened, I mean, I remember we went to Cream. We were playing in the annex and Judge Jules was playing in the main room, and there was 300 to 400 people in the whole of the venue, and the venue holds, what, 2,500 to 3,000 people. It was like, that wasn't supposed to happen.
The guitar was back in a big way, and underground parties were flash gigs, East London hoedowns with the Libertines, and a band that built themselves without the hype, the hoary old record execs and Pete Tong billing them as the next big thing. The Arctic Monkeys sang about looking good on the dance floor, but you suspected they'd never been near one in their skinny-jeaned lives. Dance music had scurried away to lick its wounds in the dark corners of drum and bass, electro and techno. Or worse, it was just music that your mum liked. So, it took another type of musician to make dance music relevant again. Indie kids dressed in neon, using guitars and synths and being labelled New Rave. Annie Mac, Klaxons, New Young Pony Club and Hadouken were sucked into this retro-modern scene.
If you speak to most people in the industry, they'll just agree that it was something made up to categorise a time, and I think people, in a way, wanted it to be bigger than what it was. They wanted it to be the new acid house, and they wanted it to, you know, represent a big movement. But I do genuinely believe that it did represent an important time, in that it represented when kids who liked indie felt like it was cool to go and be ravers again. It's a whole new generation of kids, so 13, 14-year-olds didn't know anything about rave culture. They don't know about acid house, they don't know about Shoom, they don't know about Ibiza, they don't care about Ibiza, they can't afford to go there, but they know about what bands they like through MySpace. And bands like Klaxons or Test Icicles before them opened them up to raving, but through a whole new perspective. And I guess from the people who were around the first time or were aware of what happened the first time, it was exciting to see young kids coming through and blowing their whistles and wearing their fluoro.
It's quite funny when you're like playing pop music and people are acting like it's a rave and wearing neon clothes and we're wearing black. But that's exciting. I think it's incredible to see people dress up to come to shows. It's not, I mean, that kind of community in bands and music is always like the most exciting part about going to shows. So it's great and we welcome that.
It was an attempt to kind of pull together all these disparate kind of bands that were being something other than guitar bands, which is great. I think it was good to do that. I think NME essentially, you know, were the ones that really wanted to sort of try and focus on some of these other bands because they could see this well-trodden path of indie guitar bands. It was getting stale. But, you know, they were all from very different backgrounds, different, they were doing different things, you know, Hot Chip, Cinnamon Mobile Disco, thrown in with CSS and Klaxons. I mean, they're just so different.
So it was basically something made up by some journalists?
Basically.
In a way, I think if people are going to call it New Rave, then I'd rather be with some interesting bands. There's other bands like Does It Offend You and Later the Pier that are really interesting bands doing different things. So if we're going to be categorised with them, then I'm happy.
I mean, I guess the easiest way to put it is we're a band, but with a big influence from British dance music.
New Rave was an in-joke, over before the NME could give away a glow stick, but it did prove that people always want to get out and party. How are you going to do that, though, with mobile phones and MySpace spelling out directions to the latest underground event to your internet-savvy mum and dad? Things were certainly different back in 1988.
Alright, so where is this place anyway?
Well, it's in a secret location. You just got to ring this number.
Right, and who's going to be there?
Well, I don't know.
So what's it all about then?
It's a rave day.
Nobody wrote about it, the media didn't write about it in general, till about what we're now celebrating 20 years ago, summer of '88. And I think what's happened, I would call it accelerated culture. I think what you've got is less time now for a subculture to develop. So you've got a kind of city of the instant. Something is on YouTube before you've actually invented it.
I would really love to believe that there could be something like that again, but it is quite hard to see how it would happen. If anything new comes up, companies, record companies, style companies, PR, all these people are associated with youth movement. It's been exposed and sort of exploited even before it's had a chance to develop.
It's more likely to happen in Finland or Estonia because they have less media and there's more of a chance of something interesting developing without lots of London-based journalists like me descending like vultures on a half-formed scene.
In a way, part of the appeal of those parties was the sheer difficulty of actually organising them. You're talking about a time when most people didn't have mobiles, pre-internet, trying to galvanise sufficient numbers of people through pirate radio broadcasts to meet somewhere, or meet somewhere as a decoy to the police and then drive off somewhere else. You know, those kind of things people enjoyed probably the actual getting to the party almost as much as they enjoyed the party, because it was all part of a kind of great enterprise of devious behaviour by large percentage of the young population of the country. And whether that is still possible, I don't know, because I think in the internet age, it's not possible really to keep anything hidden.
Is it necessary, I think, is more the question than is it possible. I mean, the thing is, then there was an underground club culture because most clubs closed at midnight or 1 in the morning. Now it's very hard for someone 18 to imagine a world where you couldn't dance all night, where you couldn't get a drink at 4 in the afternoon if you wanted one. But then all of those things were very firmly in place.
Ravers were one of the first groups to realise that a mobile could be used as an easy way of arranging to meet up with your friends. Now the mobile companies own big outdoor music parties. How on earth did we get along without them? We used to meet up in person and not online. We used to dance without fear of dad's dance recriminations. But just because we're grown-ups, does that mean we have to give up on music and technology entirely? Judge Jules knows a thing or two about keeping up with the kids. And does it offend you, yeah, a part of a generation who minded the gap?
The generation gap as such doesn't exist anymore. You're very likely in dance clubs to see an 18-year-old and his or her dad quite comfortably dancing alongside one another. You only need to look at the age spectrum of music buyers to realise that there is no longer a scenario where the generation gap is defined by you being appalled by what your parents are into.
There's some kids out there that see dance music as their parents' music, so there is a gap there, but my dad was just very liberal.
My dad used to, when I used to run a sound system, he used to help me out, like hiring generators on his credit card and dropping me off in the middle of nowhere with massive speakers, and he's always been really helpful in just trying to get me involved in at least something.
We look quite a lot at what customers want, and obviously, you know, no one customer is the same, but there's all sorts of groupings of the sort of things that people want, and generally running across all of them is a love of music right from an early age right the way through. It's something that really cuts across all of our customers.
Matt from O2, a mobile phone company that also runs some of the biggest arena and outdoor music events. Kids today have power as consumers, and big business knows how to harness the power of music to keep all their customers happy. The only trouble is, if we're all listening to the same music on the same gadgets, aren't we in danger of losing that secret sense of ownership that music inspires? That feeling that this is mine and it doesn't belong to anyone else? Where will the next generation of music junkies and DJs come from if we're all plugged in and online and supplied all the time? Does it offend you, yeah, mixed dance music with punk? If the next big thing is about anything, it seems it will be a hybrid.
If you were goth in the 80s, you could probably only read goth magazines and only listen to goth bands. But now with the internet and the fact that people are more eclectic, you're not going to be part of one particular scene. You're always going to be exposed to other music.
People of 18 to 25 who I teach, they're interested in all sorts of diverse musics. On their iPod, they've got something from 50 years ago, something from 1978, something from 1988. We've actually reached a stage which is you can just play something as if it's never existed before. There's no history to it.
But with all these broad tastes, will they find anyone like-minded to start the party with? Old Rave had the Hacienda, Clink Street, Shoom, Spectrum and Ibiza, but not everybody could get to the clubs, let alone get in. Maybe with more music to choose from and an entire globe to befriend, the revolution is not as far away as we might think.
In the way that Acid House before, you'd have to go and pick up a phone and ring a certain number and find out where the party was. The exact same things happen now. It's just digital, so go to a certain website and put in a certain code and then you'll find the address, or maybe it's like mobile phone text bulletins, those kind of things, but still the same things happen. And I think kids are absolutely 100% able to form a band, get their band heard by the right people and potentially go on to sell records and become successful. I think they're a little bit clever than people think, and sometimes it's a bit embarrassing watching 40-year-olds trying to market to little kids. It's just, oh, stop.
Back in those days, you would meet up with great people and you'd only see them at the club. Whereas now, those networks can be deepened. So for me, when I go and DJ abroad, I can keep in contact, you know. So actually, the potential is bigger. So instead of it being 1,000 people in the Hacienda, that could be replicated all around the world by different people.
those new technologies have allowed us to create real communities, you know, digital hippies effectively. We're back to 1968, it's just electronically done.
The kids are okay, and as for house music, it may no longer be 1988, but those repetitive beats played in darkened clubs to crowds of enthusiasts having the time of their lives, that may not have died out just yet either.
Thing is, there's always new 18-year-olds, and it's always going to be new for them. And I think one of the things that's happening now is we're slowly going into recession, whether the government wants to admit it or not. And club culture is always more exciting in times of recession because people are after an escape.
20 years ago, a lot of the guys and girls that are into it now weren't born. And me being a DJ, I'm still youthful in the way that how I present myself and how much I'm still enjoying myself.
We've been doing it now since '88. No, it's a long time to be doing anything, but we're at a point now where just feeling it more and more.
I've worn out several generations of clubbers. I went to my first nightclub in 1976 at the Cleethorpes Winter Gardens, a Northern Soul all-nighter. So that's 32 years, that's 2/3 of my life. I've been going out to nightclubs and I love it. I still get a buzz when I walk down into a basement and I can hear the thud of bass, and I just really like it, and I just can't imagine a time when I'll be bored of it.
So, has anything changed since 1988? We've come down to Fabric, it's Saturday night, we're outside this huge nightclub in London to talk to some people still queuing to listen to house music after 20 years.
I just like good music, dancing, good atmosphere and a night out, innit?
8 years I'm working most of house music, so I love house music.
We've just driven in from Leeds, 3 hours and a half drive to see one of my best pals. It's going to be a cracking night here, first time I've ever been.
My friends are down to visit for the weekend from Glasgow, so we're going to hit Fabric. We just want some banging techno, really, and just have a great time, so that's it.
What are you doing in the queue tonight?
Oh, we're going to Fabric tonight. That's where we're going. Party.
What is acid house? A whole bunch of people on acid with glow sticks.
I mean, I like the rhythm of the music. It's the main thing what I like about the house and electro music.
Just the music, and you know, you can just go out of your mind, go crazy. It's just amazing.
I like the chemistry, everything works out. I've got some shades on, yeah. I like the shades and the music, everything together is pretty sort of safe.
So, we have all grown up. Some of us are still out on the dance floor checking the newest electronic sounds, and some are doing other stuff, but still loving new music. But one thing we all agree on is that acid house did change everything. The music that turned the 80s from gloomy black and white into party-happy, full colour is still going strong, bouncing around all night in a club, on a beach, in a field, pulsing round the world, dancing, always dancing.
From Jamaica to the world, it's just love. It's just love.
Yeah, the idea of making people dance is obviously a seductive idea. People want that in their lives. People want music that's got rhythm and a groove to it because it makes people feel good.
It's always going to be there. I mean, it's a music form now. It's like jazz, it's like rock and roll. It's there, you know. There'll always be people who grow up and discover it and want to make something new with it. Because you don't have to be raving to get it. I think if you've done it at some point in your life, then you'll always be able to tap into that and you'll always have a love of the sound.
What I love about electronic music is the fact that it's always about the future, even though there is an element of nostalgia in it. Because it's technology-led, it's always quite forward-thinking.
I've
I've always loved the fact that the music that we call house in that 20 years has always morphed into other things. You know, we've had like techno, grime, garage, that all stemmed from that first big explosion.
There's a substance in the music which you attach yourself to, whether it be a groove, whether it be a bass line, whether it be vocals, whether it be the build-up or the breakdown within the music. These elements in the record push your buttons in some ways, makes you smile, makes you cry, makes you jump up and down, go crazy, makes you scream and shout. And with that, I think everyone should try it once and try not to ignore the fact that people are still having a really good time after all these years.
It was incredible. It really was an amazing time, and I hope that anybody in their life can experience that, because it was truly revolutionary musically and in the way that people interacted with each other. 88, the Summer of Love, was an amazing period in my life, and I can only say that I'm glad I survived it.
Acid House The Next Generation was presented by Chris Coco and produced by Helen Leonard for BBC Radio 2.